May it please the court. Opposing counsel. Every day, Don Barkwood wakes up and he wishes that he could tell Tiffany he loved her just one last time. What you just heard from the prosecution is that because he didn't tell her that one last time that he loved her, he's responsible for her death. What we will prove through evidence is that from the moment that Don Barkwood heard his daughter's threats of suicide, he began to take reasonable steps to stop her from killing herself, to protect her from others, and to protect her from herself. Tiffany Barkwood is just a normal teenager. She, upper middle class, going to a good high school, lived in a good neighborhood, had friends, had two parents that loved her. She had a little sister. But she went through these same ups and downs that all teenagers go through. Unfortunately, as she went into high school, she ran into some problems. And later on today, we're going to have Don Barkwood, the defendant in this case, come up and speak to y'all. He's going to explain how he began to notice that the emotions that Tiffany had that gave her her personality tended to get the better of her as she got into high school. And in fact, one night, she told him and his wife that she was going to commit suicide. And it was that night that Don decided, you know, these problems, they're more than I can handle. And it was that night, after he heard that threat, that he began to ask for help. He began to take action to stop her from fulfilling that threat. In fact, every person that comes up on the stand, every person that gives you testimony, every piece of evidence that you're going to see is a direct result of an action that Don Barkwood took to keep his daughter from killing herself. And while he's up on the stand, Don's going to tell you about how he took her to a psychologist. The psychologist diagnosed her with depression, prescribed her Zoloft. He went and got her that Zoloft. Later on, he took her to a school counselor that you're going to hear from as well. A school counselor that he thought would help her with her depression. You're also going to hear Don describe how, out of perhaps just a paternal instinct, one night he decided to look through the family computer at her emails. And what he found in those emails is something that Don has told me he's never going to forget. What he found was some emails from a man named Johnny Woods, the prosecution's star witness, Johnny Woods, a teacher at her high school. And as Don began to read these emails, he realized something was definitely wrong. In these emails from a teacher to his daughter, there was talk about love, there's talk about secrets, there's talk about them meeting, there's talk about him giving her pills. I mean, later on, we're going to listen to Pat Gonzalez, who's a school counselor. And she is the person who Don took his daughter to try to help her. And you're going to hear how Pat Gonzalez did nothing to help her, right up until the end. 2 or 3 days before she killed herself, Pat Gonzalez finally decided to act. After Tiffany had told her all of her problems, after she had met with Tiffany for almost a year, she did nothing. And while you hear that testimony, what you've got to be thinking is reasonableness. Are these the actions that a reasonably prudent person would take as viewed from that person's standpoint? Look at the relationship between Johnny Woods and Tiffany. Is it reasonable? Is it reasonable for a counselor to meet with somebody and not even help the person that they're supposed to be counseling? Reasonableness is going to play a huge factor in this trial. And it's what you constantly have to be thinking about. Because as soon as Don Barkwood found out about those threats for her to end her life, he took reasonable steps, the same as a reasonably prudent person would take in order to prevent that. Now, the prosecution has also charged Don with another charge. I believe they're calling it theft by coercion. And before we get into that, let me just tell you a little bit about Don. He is a civil trial attorney. He goes to court just about every day. He is used to dealing with tough situations. He's used to dealing with tough people. And he has a enormous faith that in this body, in a courtroom, you can solve tough problems. And so when he read those emails, he fell back on his instincts, which is go to court to solve the problem. And that's exactly what he did. You're going to hear Don testify about how he settles cases. And how you settle a case is you come to a consensual agreement. And that's exactly what happened here. And we're also going to bring a man named Jordan Thompson to the stand, who's going to describe how Don told him that this settlement agreement that he was reaching, he was going to give that money to an organization called the Children's Cancer Foundation. And Thompson is going to speak about how that was nothing new for Don Barkwood. He gave to a lot of different foundations all the time. He was known as a philanthropist, somebody that just gives to foundations. Is that somebody that only cares about money if he's going to take the money and give it away? Is that reasonable? And while we're talking about this theft, let's remember the essential rule of theft. And here's the essential rule of theft. If there is consent, there's no coercion. If there's no intent, there's no theft. In this case, there is no intent. There's only consent. And that is what's called reasonable doubt. You just heard the prosecution speak about how they have to prove every single element of the charge that they just read and they had up here. They have to prove every single one of those elements beyond a reasonable doubt. So as you're going through the trial, as you're hearing this evidence, think to yourself, is there consent? Because if you find that Johnny Woods consented to this agreement, that's a reasonable doubt. If you find that Don Barkwood did not intend to unlawfully deprive him of that money, that's a reasonable doubt. And if you find that from the moment Don Barkwood heard the threats of suicide, that he took reasonable steps to prevent that from happening, that's a reasonable doubt. And where there's a reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. Finally, put yourself in Don's shoes. You've lost your daughter, and you're in basically a pit of despair. And then you get a notice from the prosecutors saying they're charging you with the death of your own daughter. And that is when Don Barkwood called myself and my co-counsel Elizabeth Schmidt in tears. He told us his story, and we were blown away. And yet, in a case where there's so many different facets, there's so many people involved in what happened in this tragedy, why did the prosecutors pick Don? And we don't really know the answer to that question. Because despite the urgings of the legal community, despite the urgings of the parents' community where Tiffany went to school, and despite the urgings of the nonprofit community that Don contributed to, the prosecutors have continued to push this charge. And it just makes me think, and maybe this is going through your head as well, if they can charge Don with this, can they charge me? If one of my family members or if one of your family members commits suicide, are they going to come after you simply because you didn't tell them that you loved them before they died? You know, every day, Don has told me that he wakes up and wishes that he could say, "I love you," to Tiffany one more time. But he's not responsible for her death, and the evidence will prove that. And you must find him not guilty. Thank you.